My name's Caleb, and I'm a long-haul trucker. Most of my life is spent on desolate highways, where there's only me, the engine's rumble, and the empty road. I used to find peace in the solitude, but one night on Highway 19, that solitude turned into something else, something I'll never forget. It was midnight, somewhere in the northern Arizona desert, with not a single car in sight. Just the dark, endless highway stretching through barren land. My headlights cut a lonely path ahead, and I was zoning out, half listening to a crackling country station, when I saw her. She was young, maybe 17 or 18, standing in the middle of the road wearing a plain white dress. She didn't wave or move, just stared forward as if waiting. I hit the brakes, swerving to avoid her, tires screaming against the pavement. Heart pounding, I threw the truck into park and jumped out to check on her. But when I got out, she was gone. I looked around, the night eerily silent except for my own labored breathing. There was no one there. No footprints, nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, a mirage in the moonlit desert. But the uneasy feeling lingered, creeping under my skin like ice. Determined to shake it off, I got back in and kept driving, but every mile felt like I was being watched. And then I saw her again, around a bend in the road, standing on the shoulder this time. Her skin looked gray, almost ashen, and her eyes, they were dark pits, like two endless voids staring right through me. I wanted to look away, to drive past without slowing down, but I couldn't. I was compelled, glued to her gaze as if she held me there. I forced myself to speed up, trying to leave her behind, but a gnawing dread filled the cab as the miles stretched out, each one heavier than the last. When I finally pulled into a truck stop hours later, my face was pale and my hands were trembling. Another trucker, Earl, saw me and asked what had happened. When I described her, his face went white. "You saw her," he muttered, looking away. "The girl on Highway 19. Earl explained that she'd been seen there for years, always by drivers who later suffered accidents or worse. Some said she was the ghost of a girl who died on that highway. Others swore she was a curse, a warning, or worse, a trap. But then Earl leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Not everyone thinks she's just some lost soul. A lot of people think she was silenced, that she knew something she wasn't supposed to know about someone in town. Maybe she saw something, and they didn't want anyone finding out." He looked over his shoulder, as if someone might be listening. I felt a chill run down my spine. Had I really seen the spirit of a girl who died in some tragic accident? Or was she something more? A victim who had died trying to escape a secret that some powerful people wanted buried. Earl went on to tell me that some locals believed she'd been lured to the highway on purpose, forced to disappear. All I knew was that I never wanted to see her again. But as I left that truck stop and kept driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost girl on Highway 19 wasn't just haunting the road out of grief or pain. Maybe, I thought, she was still waiting for justice, for someone who cared enough to uncover the truth. From that night forward, I refused to drive Highway 19, even if it meant hours added to my routes. Sometimes late at night when the roads are empty and the shadows grow, I can still feel her presence, watching, waiting, as if daring me to cross her path again and see what I'd find. My name's Jesse, and I've been driving cross-country for nearly a decade now. It's an unpredictable lifestyle, full of long, empty stretches of road, scattered truck stops, and the occasional weird experience. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that stretch of I-95 in Maine. It was late autumn, around 1 a.m. A thick fog had rolled in, smothering the highway in an otherworldly haze. I was heading south, trying to make it to my next stop before morning. The road was deserted, as it often is that time of night, and all I could hear was the steady hum of my engine and the faint whispers of the radio static. Then out of nowhere, I saw him. A figure appeared by the side of the road, standing just beyond my headlights. He was tall and thin, with a shock of dark hair, wearing a faded leather jacket and jeans. He didn't have his thumb out or anything. He was just standing there, staring at me with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the passenger window slightly. "Need a lift?" I asked, hoping he'd say no. The guy nodded once, solemnly, and climbed into the cab without a word. There was something about his expression, a kind of quiet desperation, that made my stomach twist. Once he was seated, I tried to strike up a conversation, but he just stared straight ahead, barely even glancing at me. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the stillness of the cab. "Just down the road," he said softly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made me feel uneasy. "Not far." We drove in silence for a while, the fog pressing against the windshield like a shroud. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "So what brings you out here in the middle of nowhere?" He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Trying to get away," he murmured as if to himself. "But they always find me. Doesn't matter how far I go." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's trying to find you?" I asked, half wishing he wouldn't answer. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or something darker. "You wouldn't believe me," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there are things on this road. They hide in the fog, watching, waiting, and once they see you, well, they don't let go." My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "What are you talking about?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You'll see," he muttered. "It's only a matter of time." Suddenly, the radio crackled, and a burst of static filled the cab, loud and jarring. I reached over to adjust the dial, but no matter what station I tuned into, all I could get was static. My passenger seemed unfazed, staring blankly out the windshield. Then I saw it. Something moved in the fog, just up ahead. A shadow, darker than the mist, shifting across the road. It was gone in an instant, but I felt a surge of fear that I couldn't explain. "You saw it, didn't you?" the man asked, his voice barely audible. He was watching me now, his eyes intense. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He leaned in closer, his face pale and drawn. "They look like people at first," he whispered, "but they're not. They're shadows, things that shouldn't exist. They wait for drivers like us out on these empty roads, and once they latch on to you, they never let go." I tried to laugh it off, but there was something about his tone that made me feel like he wasn't kidding. "You're messing with me, right?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked back out the window, his expression unreadable. "You'll understand soon enough." We drove in silence for a few more miles, my heart pounding with every shadow that flickered in the fog. I kept glancing at the man beside me, trying to convince myself that he was just some drifter with a twisted sense of humor. But the look in his eyes told a different story. Then, without warning, he reached over and grabbed my arm, his grip icy cold. "Stop the truck," he hissed, his eyes wide with fear. "Now!" "What? Why?" "They're here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "If we keep going, they'll get us both. You have to let me out. Now!" Against my better judgment, I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. The man was out of the cab in an instant, disappearing into the fog without a backward glance. I watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. Part of me wanted to drive after him to make sure he was okay, but another part of me, a part I couldn't explain, knew that it was better this way. I waited a few minutes, half expecting him to reappear, but the road was silent, empty. Just me in the fog. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible over the hum of the engine. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. I glanced around, but there was no one there. Just the empty road and the thick, suffocating fog. I don't know how long I sat there listening to that whisper, frozen in place. Finally, I shook myself, started the truck, and pulled back onto the highway. I told myself that I'd just had a strange encounter with a disturbed hitchhiker, that there was nothing to worry about. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, lurking just beyond the edge of my headlights. A few days later, I heard about a trucker who disappeared on that same stretch of I-95. His truck was found abandoned by the side of the road, engine still running, but there was no sign of him. They searched for days, combing the area, but he was never found. Some people say he just up and left, that he wanted a new life. But I know the truth. I know that the shadows got him, just like the hitchhiker warned. And now every time I drive down an empty road at night, I can feel them, watching, waiting, daring me to stop. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear that hitchhiker's voice whispering from the darkness, telling me to keep driving, never to stop. Because once you stop, it's already too late.